what happens is that they start gathering people, even the people who are national service conscripts, to become part of the military center, to be soldiers, to go and fight. So they collect them from the houses and they say, where's Vanessa? Okay, Vanessa, come. And if I don't show up, if I'm hiding, my family members might get imprisoned. That happened a lot of times in the last war.
Vanessa Tsehaye is an Eritrean human rights activist and campaigner for political prisoners in Eritrea and is this year's winner of the Outstanding Activist Award at the Magnitsky Awards, which honours brave journalists, politicians and activists in the field of human rights. So Vanessa, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been honoured as someone who, at the age of 16, turned a family tragedy into a campaign called One Day Seyoum to call attention to Eritrea's mass imprisonments, conscription, no parliament or elections, and a complete lack of freedom of press. So can you walk me through exactly what is this movement?
Sure. So I grew up in Sweden with parents from Eritrea being told stories about my home country. At that point, I had never visited when I was young. 5 years old, I find out that my mom's brother had been imprisoned in Eritrea without a trial. So to me, that was the kind of starting point of everything that's happening now, is my mom being very open about what was going on in the country and to our family. And the older I got, the more I learned. Of course, I understood that my uncle's imprisonment wasn't an isolated event. It was connected to a larger systematic issue happening in the country, which was like the government's transition to a dictatorship, which happened starting in 2001, continuing up until today. That process has been intensifying, and it's created a country where people are forced to flee. Like, we have one of the largest populations of refugees in the world, especially considering the fact that we're not at war. It's simply because of the political situation. So I, anyways, grew up knowing all of this and felt this very strong responsibility to do something about it because I wasn't in the country. And for those who know Eritrea, they know it's the most censored country in the world. It always comes at the bottom of every single press freedom index compiled by organizations and institutions. So it's the fact that people can't speak up inside of the country, but I could, being outside, made me feel like I had to at least try. And not just try myself, but to try to get other people involved as well, especially people who aren't able to kind of do that by their own accord. Like, no one's sitting at home thinking, how can I start like a political movement on my own? Who has the time? Who has the skills kind of to do that? So it's like, well, if I can do that, then maybe I can get other people to join and we can do what we can from here to affect change at home. So it was inspired because I knew my uncle had been imprisoned. I knew that he wasn't able to continue like his work that he was doing. And I wanted to speak up for him, and I wanted to continue the work that he was doing for our country from here.
The life of your uncle as a journalist in a dictatorship was a very, brave and noble profession for your uncle, and for one of those things that people wanted to know about, the fact that families are not told where prisoners are being held or if they're even alive, and which is such an insane thing to happen. So what has it been like, Vanessa, for your family when Seyoum was taken in 2001, and have you heard anything since that day?
It's one of the, I would say, the tools that the dictatorship uses to silence people as well, is by not knowing where your family member is, if they're still alive, that an entire unit of people are suffering in addition to the person who's been imprisoned. Like, it's never the same level, of course, but the agony that people live with, the agony that my grandmother lived with before she passed away, that his wife has been living with for the past 24 years, that his children, his siblings, it's like, it's not, you can't really describe it. It's, beyond. I have that pain, and I've never met him. I don't know him. We're not as closely related as these other people are. And I think it's a way, and I know it's a way that the government uses to silence people, because I know that, okay, I can sacrifice myself for my country. I can speak out. I can get imprisoned. Fine. But am I willing to put my children and my entire family through that pain indefinitely? And a lot of people say no, because that's a lot to ask for, especially in a situation where change isn't really happening short term. So it's not like you go to prison for 2-3 years and then a new government comes into place. It's been over 20 years and they're still there. And this is something that's shared amongst thousands of Eritrean families. It's not a unique phenomenon. The reason, I'm obviously related to him. The campaign is named after him because of that relation, because of who he is in Eritrean society, not just because he's my uncle. He was an incredibly brave, as you said, and well-known journalist in Eritrea, but also internationally. But he's one of many. He was one of many who was taken in 2001. they were the most high profile. In 2001, it was politicians and journalists like my uncle who were imprisoned as the transition happened. It was literally, they shut down the free press, they imprisoned 10 politicians who had opposed the government, even though some of them were his own colleagues, like some of the other ministers and all of that. And then they imprisoned the journalists who had been very critical and very open about what they wanted the country to look like. So that was like the most high profile. But since then, there's, I mean, estimated around 10,000 political prisoners. And that's a low estimate. That's an estimate that I think Amnesty International made over 10 years ago, just to have, like, to signify how big the issue is. But if we could even count the amount of people who've been imprisoned in Eritrea, not just like currently imprisoned, but who have been imprisoned overall, I mean, most Eritrean families, if not all, have experienced imprisonment somehow, even if it's been short or long. And it's, yeah, the reality of the entire country.
So Seyoum, he was taken in 2001, which is, of course, the same year that the dictatorship began. So the work that he was really working on was, of course, exposing government corruption before it really officially became a dictatorship. So what kind of stories was he publishing that would get the attention of the government that would throw him in prison?
It's an interesting situation that Eritrea was in, and I've done a lot of work kind of showing that transition because I think it's important to understand the country, but it's also important to understand our own countries and understanding, you know, everything that happens isn't just unique to Eritrea or unique to whatever country we're talking about. There's patterns that are happening all over the world. And what's happening in Eritrea now, we see it in so many other places. But Eritrea was in a unique position because it had just gained independence. So we were starting a state as opposed to completely changing the state. We didn't really have a democracy, right, before. So it wasn't, I mean, a transition indicates that there was a functioning system of democracy that was operating before, and that was transitioned into a dictatorship. But Eritrea was just getting started. So what was happening in Eritrea was that we gained independence in 91 from Ethiopia after a very long independence war. And the state was being like birthed, essentially. And everyone was excited, everyone was happy, but people were noticing bad signs and bad patterns by the government, specifically by the president. And so people like Seyoum was writing a lot about stories about how the government was operating like in the wrong way. So talking about how women fighters were treated, for example, after independence. So Eritrea had like a very big involvement of women in our liberation struggle that was very praised. But then after independence, like a lot of these women were discarded completely. Many of them end up like losing their position in the military, even though the men were like promoted. It's not like an unusual pattern, but he exposed that to give just to give one example and showed different things that were happening. I was like, this is showing that we're not moving towards the Eritrea that we fought for. He was also a fighter. Most of the people who were imprisoned in 2001 were also independence fighters. So this was like the dream that they had sacrificed, some of them 20, 30 years of their lives for. And so he was exposing how the transition wasn't going the way that they thought it would be. And then essentially what happened was slowly they were building, the constitution was being written, it was passed by parliament, but it was never implemented by the government. A war broke out with Ethiopia. Some people say that the Eritrean president did that on purpose to distract the political kind of reality from the transition to this like war reality that they had to focus all their energy on instead. And so that gave him some time, but in 2001, the war had ended, elections had to happen, and the politicians were pressuring them. Again, the journalists were writing about this, including my uncle, saying what's happening with the election. Eventually, these politicians went public, and they were amplified by these journalists. And the government was waiting for the right opportunity to do what they did. That's what everyone who was working closely to the government at the time said, that the president had this plan, right? He wanted democracy to not be implemented. And 9/11 gave him that window. So 9/11 happened, the entire world was distracted. And 7 days later, a week later, the free press was shut down, politicians were imprisoned, journalists were imprisoned, and the country has just gone downhill since. Parliament has been closed down since. The only university in the country has been closed down. Everyone is forced to be a part of the National Service Army, which has been likened to slavery. I can list the form of oppressions in the country forever, but it started in 2001 with the official shift to dictatorship.
So this lack of press freedom, as you mentioned, it has been described as Africa's North Korea. So what is it like? I mean, I know that you're obviously not based in Eritrea, but what is it like on the ground in Eritrea to not have access to what's going on in their own country and to only read news when it comes out of government propaganda?
I mean, it's a very fascinating reality. It's almost like an interesting experiment to look at, like what happens to a population when you only have access to very specific forms of information and living under constant both surveillance but also propaganda. And I've worked a lot. I mean, I've been doing, since, as you said, this work for, 12 years at this point. And we have found that with people who live in Eritrea, like everyone's different, of course, but we have such a strong military culture because of the war, the independence war, and a lot of people fought. Everyone has a family member who fought. Most families have family members who've lost someone in the war. So there's already a very strong like nationalistic spirit. And it's been very interesting how the government has used like nationalism and national identity through propaganda, and also through fear, right? Because if you don't have the if you don't feel comfortable enough to like explore further, to ask more questions, you're going to be stuck into what you already think. And there's a lot of people who fled the country, who have said, I believed our government was the best government until I was 18, until I was 17, until they were at the age where they were learning, I guess, more, both in school, but also, I mean, school is obviously limited, but still it does encourage some form of critical thinking, but also has more access. Like the older they have become and the older Eritrea has become, the technology has really changed too. There is more access to like satellite, for example. More people can afford satellite now. There is some form of access to the internet, even though it's very limited and not all apps works, and you can only use it for certain like periods of time, and it's surveilled. If you're using the internet cafes, it's 100% surveilled. So people are scared, right? But still, like there's some form of consciousness that happens the older you become, and so it's very interesting to see how a government has been able to form a population that many support them until they understand what's actually happening. I mean, I've met people. I've done a lot of trainings with young Eritreans, political like campaigning trainings and stuff, and I made references, and I learned early on that I shouldn't assume, and it's nothing to do with political interest or intelligence. It's literally living in a propaganda state where I was like, oh, for example, the Arab Spring, and the entire room just looked at me saying like, what's the Arab Spring? Because this wasn't covered in Eritrea. No one knew about the Arab Spring because the government didn't want to inspire anyone to do the same thing. And if you look at the school system in Eritrea, the education system, too, both the curriculum, but also if you look at the teachers, people have to be teachers because of the national service system. So you finish you finish high school. If you score high enough, you can go to the technical colleges that exist. They're not universities, but they're a form of higher education. And then you get placed in a course. You don't decide what you study. But these are only very few people can get this opportunity. You don't get to choose what you study. And then from there on, some of you can become a teacher, you can become an administrative person somewhere in a government office. You can just get placed in any job, in any position, in any place. And so many of them become teachers, and they don't want to be teachers. They have no desire to be teachers. They are not qualified to be teachers because some of them haven't even studied the things that they're teaching, and they definitely don't have any teaching training either. And they get paid almost nothing. So you have like the worst conditions for someone to be a good teacher. It's already hard enough to be a teacher, even in other countries. But all of these three things considered, you don't choose what you're doing, you're not trained for it, and you don't get paid well. So the teaching experience in Eritrea is not very good, especially for the students, of course. So this plays into the propaganda too, because you're not, creating a population that is like, intelligent and, I mean, from education point of view, and is like informed and knows about critical thinking and has comparative examples outside of the country. So yeah, it creates it's a population that isn't very likely to attack back, essentially.
You mentioned this open-ended mandatory national service. The UN likened it to slavery, as you said. So just for the audience, virtually every Eritrean between the ages of 18 to 40, male or female, are forced to this national service. So I think, am I right in saying that they actually have to do 18 months, but it ends up being years?
Yeah, so according to the first proclamation that it introduced this in Eritrea, which again came off the legacy of the war, because the war ended and they needed to still have like an active military, and they needed to rebuild the country, and they thought, people want to contribute, and people want to contribute. It's not about wanting or not wanting to contribute to their country, but the form that the national service has taken has become something completely different to what it was. And so it's supposed to be 18 months, like most countries have national service, military service. But what happens is you do your time in your last year of high school, which I mentioned before when I was showing the route, right, for education. So your first 18 months is your last time in high school. Your last year in high school is in a military camp, a brutal military camp. Both conditions there, weather-wise, but also the activities that they do, where they live, everything is very, very difficult. And then you do a test at the end of the year. The people who score the highest, very, very few people, get to take the route towards education. and the people who don't are automatically transferred into the national service system, where they are placed in any job that the government sees fit. These jobs are not as good as the jobs that comes through education. So it could be like working on a mine, working on the streets, like it could literally be any physical labor that the government needs. Being a soldier, just being a soldier, there was a war that happened that Eritrean soldiers went to. They were all national service conscripts who went without having a choice. And then the second route is you go through, you have your higher education learning, you finish, and then you get channeled into the same system of national service, but in very different kinds of positions. So slightly better off, because you're not doing the manual labor kind of thing. You're not a soldier, but you're still working for the government essentially for free, indefinitely. So it is technically 18 to 40, but people way above that, like to 60, 65, even older. And you see now there's hopefully not, but there's a potential war happening between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And what happens is that they start gathering people, even the people who are national service conscripts, to become part of the military center, to be soldiers, to go and fight. So they collect them from the houses and they say, where's Vanessa? Okay, Vanessa, come. And if I don't show up, if I'm hiding, my family members might get imprisoned. That happened a lot of times in the last war.
You mentioned this kind of these tactics from the government to make sure that there is no uprising, to make sure that there's no fighting back. Now, I was looking up kind of the facts about Eritrea, and it's so interesting. It obviously became a dictatorship in 2001, as you mentioned, and the inner circle of the president is estimated to be around fewer than 50 individuals, top-level ministers potentially as low as 20. And then the population is 3.8 million, so that's roughly one person representing in parliament for 75,000 people. So Eritrea's political power is held by an extremely tiny number of people compared to its total population. So in reality, you would look at that and think they have the ability to fight back, to try and go for an uprising, to try and throw this government out of power. But is it just not something that they think about?
No, I think it's a question that people ask ourselves as Eritreans, and I think that people outside of Eritrea wonder as well. It is an interesting situation in Eritrea where the price of speaking up is your life. Like there's no way around it. If you decide to speak out, you will get imprisoned and no one will know where you are and you'll disappear forever, essentially. That's what's happened to people before them. And you know that's what's going to happen to you as well if you do it. And it's become, I don't think that's the only reason, but it has become something that people are not able to do, because if you go become imprisoned, already, you're already living off a very low salary, national service conscript. You're getting almost nothing. Your family is not going to survive without you. And so people choose, their form of rebellion is to leave the country. They leave, they eventually make it, hopefully some of them, not all of them, to a safe place. In that safe place, either in Europe or in North America, they start making money, they send money back to their families, they help them flee too. So the solution has turned into fleeing as opposed to like revolting. And I think there are many more reasons for it. Like Eritrean, we haven't even talked about the economic situation, but it's been manipulated by the government. Prices have been manipulated. It's incredibly expensive to be in Eritrea. It's way more expensive than even some European countries, despite us, like people are not making any money. But the dollar has been kind of artificially, like likened to the NAFA, the Eritrean currency. Yeah, so essentially in Eritrea, like you'll pay the same prices, but no one's making any money. And electricity gets cut off at random times. You don't get basic supplies. Water gets cut off at random times. Again, as an effort to just make people obsessed with survival. And obviously that's our primary concern, is surviving as human beings and your family surviving. So people are very preoccupied with when is the water coming? When is electricity coming? You have a coupon that decides how much food you're allowed to buy from the government supermarkets. You can go to the private ones, but they're very expensive because export and import is very limited. So you are literally dependent on having this coupon. If the government doesn't like you for whatever reason, that coupon will be cut. So there are people who have been said, oh, you have to go to this government like activity or event celebrating Independence Day or celebrating whatever the government wants you to celebrate. And if you don't go, you don't get your coupon for this month. So like wow. Survival is at the core
it's
of
a lot
existence.
Of control.
Yes. And so people don't have the time or the ability to really think about resistance.
You've obviously spent 12 years, as you've said, pushing this activism for human rights of Eritreans. So in order for you to push this advocacy and to hold people accountable for their crimes and for their control of a country, what sort of measures do you go to, especially with getting young Eritreans to even document forms of abuse inside of the country?
So I started the organization One Day Seyoum in my uncle's name, and it has kind of transitioned into this human rights organization trying to find solutions for Eritreans. So for me, an Eritrean is the same whether they live inside the country or if they fled and they're living as refugees outside. So we have kind of split up our work between trying to address issues happening inside and outside. Our more effective work is for the refugee work because it's happening outside the Eritrean government's realm, really, because it's very difficult to have an impact inside of the country. But our long-term work is around the country inside. So as you said, documentation of crimes, building and investing into young political activists who have fled the country outside, who live now outside of the country, building consciousness outside around Eritreans, hopefully reaching it inside as well. But really focusing on the population that is outside because they're the only ones that we can actually work with. And then refugee work is around protecting their rights, whether they are being abused by government groups outside or non-government groups, and really fighting for their releases when they get imprisoned or when they get abused in whatever form that happens.
What has your relationship been like with the UN? Have they helped you a lot?
I mean, it really depends on how the UN is categorized, I guess. Or there's different parts of the UN. So there's the Human Rights Council, for example, has been quite the UN High Commission for Human Rights, for example. They've been very helpful. So I've been there. I've been invited several times to speak about the conditions. A big part of what we do is advocacy, of course, which I probably should have mentioned. That's our biggest, one of our biggest programs is working on campaigning issues affecting Eritreans inside the country through advocacy and mobilizing governments and institutions like the UN, EU, African Union. There's not a big political appetite to work in Eritrea. It's not considered to be a priority country. So we fight for our place, and we've been supported in different ways. But there's so many UN resolutions that have passed or that haven't passed because of governments as opposed to the institution. So there's many times when, for example, when Ethiopia has been at peace with Eritrea, they have made sure that certain things are not passing or not happening. There was a time when it could have been taken to the Security Council and then from there to the Hague, but that wasn't passed, for example, and that was a big, big mistake from the UN. And there's an Eritrean special rapporteur that works specifically on Eritrean issues that has been very helpful. And they've had staff specifically that have been incredibly helpful whenever we have issues, especially focusing on Eritrean refugees. So I think the experience has been mixed because it's such a big institution, but yeah.
Vanessa, just finally, has there been a story or an example of success you've made in your mission that has kind of made you look back and think, and this is why I'm doing what I'm doing?
I think from two perspectives. If you look at refugee work that we've done, we've stopped so many deportations back to Eritrea. And I know firsthand what happens to people who get deported. They get imprisoned, in very bad conditions. I've documented those, stories myself of people who have been imprisoned after. And so every single time we've stopped a deportation, I'm like, I can't believe it. Now one more person is not going to go to... it feels so worth it. And it's so rare when you work on Eritrean issues to have that form of success. And I think in the other side, if you flip the coin and you look at, the other issues happening inside the country, knowing when I work with young Eritreans who have been informed by our work online or through our campaigning work and have been empowered to become political activists or been trained by us, that for me feels like such a success because that's an investment into the country long term. And that's the kind of work that I'm really, really passionate about. So, yeah.
Vanessa Tsehaye, thank you so much for joining and congrats on your award.
Thank you very much.